Welcome to the Mom as Well podcast. We are digging deep into the gifts and the gaps of foster and adoptive parenting. I'm Tara Hutton, and I'm glad you're here. Mama's Well. Yes, she is. Hey guys, if you are new to the Mom as Well podcast, thank you for joining. And let me just tell you what we have going on here. And as I've not quite met a 2-year mark of doing this, but every time I sit in front of this camera and think about what Mom as Well is, I get clearer. And while it is about foster care and parenting kids in care and parenting kids who've been adopted, because they do have unique and special needs, it's really about parenting. It's about all the ways that parenting is growing me up. It's healing me from my own woundedness that I experienced in my childhood. And it's just learning. It's about learning. It's about learning that I have my own work to do and that I have my own healing to do, and that my children actually bring that to my attention and help me do that. And so if that is the journey that you're on, you're in good company, and thank you for joining us. Today's guest, I want to set this up, and this is a topic that before April 11th, 2015, I don't know that I would have ever thought I would have been talking about this topic, but on that is the day that I lost my dad to suicide. And very traumatic day in the lives of my family and my brothers and their families. And you know what? Since then, I've learned that I am just one of many, many, many people who have experienced and been involved in some shape, form, or fashion with suicide. I've learned that my dad's age group is I wrote this down, that they are the highest number of people dying by suicide, but that it is the second leading cause of death for people who are ages 15 to 24. And so those are pretty staggering numbers. It's the 10th leading cause of death in the United States. And so again, this is a serious thing, and I think in the state of anxiety that our world is in, I think it's important that we talk about it. And so, you know me, I like to find the experts. And the really cool thing that happened was I realized we have an expert that lives like right down the road. And her practice is actually the only practice in the United States that is an outpatient practice that exclusively deals with suicide. So she is well-versed on this topic, and I know she's going to have a lot to share with us. And so I'm excited to introduce you to Whitcomb Terpening. Terpening. Hi, Whitcomb.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. You're very busy, and I'm really thankful that you would take a few minutes or an hour out of your time and come sit down with us. And this is a heavy topic. And tell us a little bit about, who you are, whatever you want to share about your family life and your professional life. And then one more thing, how in the world did you venture into this line of work? Because this is heavy stuff.
Yeah. All right, starting at the top.
Okay, your family and you.
Yeah, so I am the youngest of 3, born to a single dad. I was raised by a single dad and my grandmother. And that just came with a lot of stuff. That's a different podcast.
Yeah.
So now I'm happily married. We're to my husband, Patrick. We've been married almost 15 years and have 2 little boys who are 9 and 6. And then professionally, I'm a clinical social worker here in Houston. And I'm also a doctoral student at Johns Hopkins in the School of Public Health.
Okay.
And the idea behind that is to be able to work with suicide on a national level, policy and research and that kind of such. But for now, and I think for some for a long time. I don't plan on stopping this work anytime soon. But my professional work these days is as a therapist, working with folks who have any kind of suicide experience. So we see folks who have who are living with suicidal thoughts themselves, who have survived a suicide attempt, who have lost someone to suicide, who are caring for anybody that's suicidal. And then I work with a lot of professionals who are trying to beef up their own trainings to work with this population.
Yeah. And the name of your group, you had to educate me on this, and I have been touched by suicide, but I didn't know, is the Semicolon Group.
Yes.
Tell us what that means.
Yeah. So the Project Semicolon was started 10, 15 years ago, maybe, in a different part of the country. But it was started by a woman who was experiencing suicidal thoughts herself. And her way of moving through it and trying to make sense of it was to attach a object, really, so that she could remind herself constantly that her story isn't over. So she was the one who really came up with the idea of the semicolon and having that be
like
known.
Yeah.
A simple way to for the community who have been affected by suicide to recognize each other. So the idea is that it's a semicolon, not a period, right? So the story is not over yet. So any kind of dark time, suicidal thoughts included, that there's still life past those moments.
Yeah.
So when I was starting my practice, I wanted to find a way to signal to the community and to the folks that were reaching out that I'm here for them, that this practice is for them and it's exclusively for them. And so we adopted, the semicolon as part of our name to pay homage to the work that's already been done by her.
I think that's beautiful. You mentioned that and I didn't know this. I know this is your heart and your passion, but you mentioned working with other professionals and educating them. And I read, is it USA Today article?
Yes.
That I found on your website, actually, that talks about how professionals aren't really well trained. Can you tell just briefly?
Yeah. So for any licensed professional, you have to have a minimum of a master's degree, right? And then clinical training on top of that. So ideally, suicide is covered as part of graduate education for mental health counselors and therapists and social workers and psychologists, but it's not. There was a survey done in the article, talks more about it, the research behind it, but I think it's only 25% of graduate schools offer anything at all to do with suicide for mental health professionals while they're going through their academic training. So there's another subset when they're doing their clinical training that gets some experience in it, especially if they've done any work in hospitals. But for the vast majority of folks that are in private practice that are working with mental health, there's not any training unless people seek it out themselves, which
or
a lot of
just
people
had
don't.
Experience just
Exactly.
in the field. Yeah. Well, I'm glad you're doing that work. I think it's really important. I shared just like a few. You have a really great video on your website, which is the semicolongroup.com.
Yes.
Okay. And it's the first thing that kind of popped up there, if I remember right. And it just goes through statistics for suicide. And so I mentioned a couple of them because, like I said, honestly, I think, and maybe we can all relate to this when we go through like a trauma, but you think, one of your first thoughts is this isn't supposed to happen to me. This isn't part of my story, right? And it was part of my story. It is part of my story. But I think that's a really normal response. But as when I chose to talk about it, we talked about it from day one. We didn't try to hide what had happened to my dad. And but one of the things that I've uncovered is that since when you do talk about it, you start to realize like there's other people around you that have experienced this. So give us some of what are the statistics that these are parents primarily, some foster and adoptive parents, some parents, but what are some statistics that you feel like are really relevant for us to know as parents in this suicide world?
Yeah, I think you touched on a couple of them earlier about it being the 10th leading cause of death overall for Americans, the second leading cause of death for youth from ages 15 to 24, second only to accidents. And a lot of those accidents are ruled as accidents, but should be ruled as suicide. So there's a lot of stuff that goes into actually ruling deaths as suicide. Yeah. And then I think another important one to note is that males die by suicide 3 times more often than females, but females attempt suicide 3 times more often than males. So males typically choose more lethal means, right? So there's not as much going back. It's just this quick, firearms, for example, are the number one cause of death for that men choose to die by suicide. And women or females, younger girls, typically choose poisoning as their method for suicide attempt. So, our body thankfully has some natural rejections to those kinds of things. So we see that women and females survive their attempts much more often than males. And then the Trevor Project is another great organization. It's a national organization that focuses on mostly the research around suicide and LGBTQ plus youth and young adults. So they do a survey every year, maybe every 2 years, where they survey the community and figure out what the most recent trends are for that population. So their most recent one showed that 42% of LGBTQ youth seriously considered attempting suicide in the past year, and that over half of folks who identify as transgender or non-binary for youth are attempting suicide or considering attempting suicide. So those are astronomical numbers.
Yeah.
And then that adoptees are 4 times more likely to attempt suicide than those who have not ever been placed out of the biological home. And so I think that's, an important one to pay attention to for this.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And so we could, and I know you're going to talk about this, but what is that relationship? And I mean, obviously we all experience some form of trauma, like attachment trauma, or, there's even children who have been taken from mom at birth. There is a traumatic response in that child. What is the relationship? I mean, between, what do you think? Speculate here, and then this may not be a speculation at all, huh? That's a silly word,
not,
right?
Yeah, not so much a speculation.
Okay.
There was a great webinar done by another organization, United Survivors International, that just recently, I wrote down the date, February 15th, so just a few weeks ago.
Oh, wow.
Did a webinar on how stress response and trauma relate to suicide. And so that comes up with this population too, because even little babies who are exposed to stress in utero have, their brains are changed. They have different chemicals in their brains.
Yeah.
And so as those kiddos grow older, their body's response to stress shows up in some of these traumatic kind of responses to behavior, their behavioral response to the trauma. And so even if, they were adopted as an infant, grew up in a loving home with the most amazing parents, had great siblings, great family, the body still remembers the stress that they were exposed to in utero. And typically that takes 10, 12, 13 years for that to start showing up as an adolescent. So it's all around the biological response to stress.
So I wonder why, I guess this just puberty, hormone changes, different things. I know that trauma is, I've read that basically different developmental stages, you may see different symptoms of previous trauma.
Yes.
So, so basically you're saying, so what was the outcome of that? I mean, what was the study saying? They're saying the stress response is associated with
higher rates of suicidal thoughts.
Okay, suicidal thoughts. Okay,
yes.
Gotcha. Okay, because when we go into, I mean, here's the thing: when we go from the top part of our brain, where we can think, to the back part of our brain, we lose our ability to reason.
Exactly.
And think.
Yep, and that's any trauma. It's not just specific to babies who were adopted, but any kind of trauma, right? Being in and out of foster homes, experiencing a major car accident, losing a parent traumatically, any kind of trauma that anybody's exposed to, the rates of suicidal thoughts increase in those populations who have especially unaddressed trauma.
Yeah. So, you know, and in my mind, my immediate response is to go to a stress response when I hear that kind of information, right? Because I do have an association with suicide. I do know it's real. So I can immediately go, okay, I have 2 adopted children. Okay, you know, like I have suicide now in my family, you know, all these other things. And so what I'm telling myself right now is to breathe and to move back up into this space and to recognize my ability to help my children learn to deal with their stress response, just like I'm learning to deal with mine.
And that's exactly what it is. It doesn't, just because folks have had some kind of trauma, does not mean that they automatically consider suicide or that they automatically attempt suicide at higher rates, right? It just means that they're more at risk. It's something else to pay attention to be cognizant of, to make sure you're listening for.
Yeah.
And to lean into if and when that does come up.
Man, I'm gonna rely on my notes today because I might go off track a bit. So that kind of let's see. That kind of brings me to, you know, we're talking about who's at risk, trauma response, right? We have trauma puts us at risk. What are other contributing factors? Like, and because we also have talked about, we on our phone call, we talked about this perfect storm, like that it's not just this one factor. There's usually a contribution of, you know, kind of like a domino, like maybe a domino falls, but there were other things involved that didn't keep that one domino from crashing. Right. I guess.
Yeah. And there are lots of, I don't know about lots, but there are several theories of suicide and suicide risk. The one that I most ascribe to, I think that's the easiest to digest and to understand, is the one developed by Thomas Joyner out of Florida State University from 2005 or 2006. So his theory is called the interpersonal theory of suicide risk. And he suggests that the folks who are at highest risk of suicidal thoughts and suicidal attempts are at the convergence of 3 factors. So it's people who feel like they are a burden to other people, whether they feel like their mental health is a burden, their physical illnesses are a burden. In some capacity, they feel like they're a burden to their loved ones. Thwarted belongingness, which means that they feel like there's not a place where they belong. They don't feel like they have a good group, a good social connection. Maybe they feel like an outsider at work or in their family. And then this other notion that he calls acquired capability. So this is the ability to, inflict harm on yourself, I guess is the easiest way to put it. So if people have if they feel like they're a burden and they don't have belonging, but they are scared of death or they're scared of pain, right? They're not at a super high risk of suicide. It's worth looking at, it's worth paying attention to and having a conversation for sure. But unless they have that acquired capability where they're not scared of pain, they're not afraid to die, they're not at a high rate for suicide risk. On the other side, folks may be adrenaline junkies, for example. They like doing skydiving or riding motorcycles at fast speeds or doing some of these other kind of things that put them at risk for harm or death.
Yeah.
But if they don't feel like they're a burden, if they're not experiencing that thwarted belongingness, then they're not a high risk for suicide. And if they were to die, unfortunately, from any of those means, it would be considered an accident. It's not considered suicidal behavior,
right?
Because intent has to be there, right? The intent to die has to be is the biggest part of whether something is considered suicidal thoughts or not. And so, yeah, it's when these 3 meet, people feel like they don't belong, they feel like they are a burden, and they have that acquired capability, is when the risk of suicide is particularly high. Yeah. And there's a graphic that I can share where it puts these 3 together, and it shows that where those come together, it's small in comparison. And I think that's an important thing to note too, that people thinking about suicide is a fairly common human experience, but the folks who are at high risk for suicide are much, much smaller.
Okay, I want to talk about that, but when you were talking about the belonging, I think that is a very deep, deep wound for children who have been adopted.
Yes.
And in foster care. Like, so they have the trauma response, but they also, there is a deep wound that says, I don't belong. And I think that that's worth noting too. And
I think it comes up a lot in youth in general, right? And yes, compounded with folks who have been through the foster care system or been adopted. I think they feel a little bit deeper.
Yeah,
but
and I mean, all there is for us to do as parents is to recognize that. Like when we recognize that, we can kind of nurture into it as opposed to not understanding that it exists. You know what I'm saying?
And noticing when our kids are pulling back and isolating and encouraging them to not do that.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, so let's talk about what you just said. I might not be exactly on track here, but I like where we're going. You said, and you call this, I think what you were saying, you said it's a human, like, what is the word? Experience to experience suicidal thoughts. Or what? No, what? Tell me exactly what you said.
Yeah. I don't know what exactly I said.
Yeah.
It's a human experience to think about suicide from time to time.
Okay.
But it doesn't always have action behind it. So suicide is contrary to popular belief, right? It's not this binary experience where someone's either thinking about suicide, has a plan, and is attempting suicide, or they don't have suicidal thoughts at all, right? So it's not as easy to say it's black and white. Most of it's actually in that big, massive gray area.
Yeah.
So it's not uncommon for folks from time to time to think about their death and out of a curiosity, right? What would it be like if I died? Who would show up to my funeral? Who would notice? Would my, friends that stopped talking to me in third grade, would they feel sorry, right? All of these questions, can and do come up, I think, for most people. And then it's a step further, right? If someone then considers, what if it would be like if I died by suicide, if I took my life? So it takes it up a little bit from just thinking about mortality to thinking a little bit more about their suicide. And then it can increase a little bit more if they're thinking more definitively about it. How would I do it? What would I do? What is my plan? When do I do it? And then the next step, right? If they're actually gathering those supplies or thinking about what it would actually take, if they're planning for to give away things or writing a suicide note, different kind of suicide behaviors, gathering pills, whatever it is. And then of course there's the highest where people are attempting suicide. So I think any part of that is cause to pay attention to, should raise red flags, right? All of that is deserving of time and attention. But the way to talk about it is different if it's just this curiosity rather than this actionable, I want to end my life. These are the steps that I'm taking.
Yeah. I think I heard you call it a spectrum. Like it's like, we're all on this thing called being human. And part of being human is sometimes to be really disappointed in ourselves or feel like we've really disappointed other people. I know this is a trigger for me to think, if I've really disappointed someone, I have thoughts of like, they would just be better off without me. Everyone would be better off without me. I don't think that makes me suicidal. I think it makes me recognize that I'm deeply distraught over something and depressed in a moment. You know what I'm saying? Like, just like depression, we can feel depressed or we can be in depression. We can experience these. That's what you're saying, right?
Yeah, it makes you human.
Makes you human, yeah.
Yes.
So it's okay to, obviously it is because it is what it is, but I know it scares my husband when I say something like that. You would just be better off without me. Because, we've all experienced suicide. So like, but that doesn't mean that for me. Now I'm mindful of that because I know how it makes my husband feel. But I think it is normal, right? To feel those feelings at times.
Yeah, it is normal to be sad and to be upset and to be frustrated and to question. Those are all our human things.
And what do we do with that?
And so the follow-up is, the follow-up is to ask directly, oh, does that, are you thinking about suicide? Are you thinking about taking your life? And so there's another common fallacy or myth in I think in general in our society where if we talk about suicide, if we ask someone about suicide and they're not thinking about it, we think that that's going to put the idea in their head, right? But that is absolutely not the case. The research after research after research after research shows definitively that that is not the case. That in fact, it is the exact opposite. That if folks are thinking about suicide and they're asked directly, that they feel better, they feel more open, they feel more willing and able to talk about it versus never being asked. So sure, you might ask 90 people, 100 people, and 90 of them will say, no, I'm not thinking about suicide. That's not where I was going. But 10 people might say, yeah, I am actually. And that would give you a point to go off to figure out how to help them and where to plug them in at that point. But you would never know that if you didn't follow it up.
Yeah. What is the point? Where do you go after that? What if they say that? What if they say, yeah, I am?
I mean, again, back to the spectrum, right? It depends on how severe their thoughts are. Unfortunately, there is not a wealth of availability for outpatient therapy, which is why I started this practice. But most of suicidal experiences are either go untreated or they get treated in hospitalization when they're at crisis levels. And so there is certainly a time and place for inpatient hospitalization. They're absolutely there for a reason. They're helpful to help stabilize folks when they need it. But if folks go to inpatient hospitalization, especially if it's involuntarily, they have a higher rate of attempting suicide after their discharge in that first 30 days than if they never went to inpatient hospitalization.
Wow.
So it's again, it's there. It's certainly there.
Why do you think that is?
I think part of it is this belonging, right? They feel like if my parents can't handle this, if my aunt can't handle this, whoever it is that I talk to about my suicidal thoughts, if they can't handle it, I don't feel like I belong to them.
Got it.
They don't feel like they can handle me. I'm too much for them. And so they go to the hospital. They get stabilized. They do a lot of group therapy, a lot of individual therapy. It's a great experience while they're there. But if they don't get connected to somebody after they get out of hospitalization, then they get this kind of culture shock of going back to the quote unquote real world, where life was just how it was before they went in the hospital. And now they have this stigma associated with inpatient hospitalization. So again, it's different if folks go voluntarily, if they're willing to go, if they understand that they do need a higher level of care and they're willing to go on their own, with support usually. Those rates aren't necessarily there on the back end of it. They're also more willing to connect to outpatient therapy or IOPs.
What does that mean?
IOP.
Uh-huh.
You're putting me on the spot.
Oh, sorry.
No,
sorry.
it's the step down from inpatient hospitalization
So it's
and
like
outpatient
a
therapy.
partial, like you're...
Yep.
Okay.
Individualized outpatient program.
Okay.
I don't think that's
Yeah.
quite it, but
Okay,
but
something like that.
it's where they go.
A hybrid.
It's like a hybrid, yeah.
Okay.
So they live at home. They're not
Okay.
in a hospital, and they go to groups like 3 times a week for 3 or 4 hours at a time. So it's an intensive outpatient program.
Oh, there you
we go.
Yeah, I knew it.
I was going to get there.
Sorry about that.
No, you're fine.
Yeah.
So it's
I see.
it's a hybrid, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of the step down from inpatient is IOPs.
Okay.
But if people go there involuntarily, they're not as willing usually to access those IOPs or outpatient therapy.
Got it.
And so that's where the increased rates after hospitalization shows up.
You keep mentioning, and in this work that I keep having people on to talk about various things. Like I had a therapist on a few weeks ago to talk about addiction, and the thing that we keep coming to is that sense of belonging and that connection.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's like magic. It's like the medicine for everything. To feel like you can be all of you. And it makes me cry. That you could be all of you with somebody else and still experience love. Like, it's like the magic medicine.
It is, yeah. And ideally that happens at home. Ideally that happens with, loving parents or siblings or grandparents. But unfortunately that's not always the case. And to touch back on those LGBTQ adolescents in particular, there's a lot of folks who are in that population who don't feel accepted in their homes. I think the Trevor Project, and I might be misquoting them, but I think on their last survey, only 1 in 3 LGBTQ plus youth felt accepted in their home. 1 in 3 felt accepted. So 2/3 of folks who are gender and sexual minorities and youth don't feel like home is the place where they do get that love and acceptance. And so to piggyback off that, any adult, any good, loving, supportive figure decreases suicidal risk.
Yeah.
So even if that's a teacher at school or a coach or an aunt or mom's best friend or whatever, any one person significantly reduces the rate of suicidal thoughts in those kids who don't even feel accepted at home.
Yeah. Wow.
So it doesn't have to be home. Ideally it's home, but
right.
But
Ideally
anybody.
it's home, but sometimes whatever it is, and I'm learning as a mom, like there are things that trigger me into a trauma response that I don't have a good grounding with yet, and for example, doing homework with my daughter. And I recently decided that I'm not the best person to do homework with her. And I don't know why I beat my head against the wall for that for 3 years, but I think that's recognizing that there are some other people out there, potentially already in my village, that could come alongside and be a part of that belonging for my daughter, for anyone, really. You know what I mean? Like if you're a mom and you are struggling in whatever way, it's okay to find other people.
And I think that's actually
mentor your child in some way. You know what I mean?
And I think it's actually protective in thinking about suicidal risk too, because if your child only has you, again, great.
Yeah.
They need to feel loved and accepted by somebody. But kids are kids, right? They get mad at parents all the time. We say the wrong thing. We don't let them go out to whatever. They're going to get mad. That's just part of being a kid and a parent. But if they have somebody else that they can lean on for support, that they can go complain and vent about how mom said no again about this, right? Whether that's a neighbor or, again, a friend, a friend's mom, like whatever that other person is, that, increases their support system, increases their belonging. So that it's not just relying on the one thing, and if it's broken, then yeah.
And as a mom, you have to. What I think took me so long is to surrender the fact that, I'm a teacher. Should is such a such a close your ears shitty word.
Yep.
But I should know how to do this. You know what I'm saying? And there's just some things I can't do.
And that's okay. We have to recognize.
And it's okay, but I love this. I love it. Really, that resonates with me. That sense of belonging. It doesn't have to be. It is at home, but it can be other places too. And it's powerful. And that's great. That's good. That's a good nugget. That's a good nugget. Okay. Let's see how. Okay. So we hear you when we say that we need to ask. Right? We need to ask when we hear these things. It's okay to talk about. Pretty much everything can be on the table.
Everything should be on the
table. There's that word again. No, if suicide is on the table, that's pretty much one of the darkest, words, right? Everything should be on the table. So how do we open up these conversations with our kiddos? So how do we open up the conversations? And then what if you have the kid who doesn't want to talk to you about it? Who doesn't even want to talk about when they're sad? Who doesn't want to talk about any of that?
So there's 2 things that came to mind.
You're good.
Okay. 2 things that came to mind when you're talking about that. The first one is, what do I do with the kid who doesn't want to talk, right? So if the kid is going through life quote unquote fine, right? Their sadness, their suicidal thoughts, their depression, their, you know, friend strife or relationship, whatever, isn't affecting their ability to move through life. They're still able to go to school. They're still getting the grades that they're used to getting. They're still able to maintain social connection. Then there's not this huge rush to go out and get help. I mean, I'm a personal fan of therapy. You know, if I ever run for political office, I'm not. But if I do, I'm running on like a campaign of everybody gets therapy at 10.
I love it.
I think
I'll vote for you.
Thanks. Not going to happen. But yeah, I mean, I think it's so important to have an outsider, third party who doesn't know your family, who doesn't know, you know, anything about the kid, where the kid is an adult for that matter, can have a space that's truly theirs. It's so powerful. And I think that the younger we get our kiddos used to that kind of environment is better. And it doesn't have to be this big problem to go out and seek therapy, right? It's my kid's 10 and about to go into middle school, and I want to make sure that they've got a place. Or yeah, maybe they had a death in the family, or maybe, you know, their best friend's moving away and they're having a hard time with that, or whatever. It doesn't have to be any of these big life circumstances, but it certainly can be too. So I think there's a lot of room in our society to normalize therapy. So it's not just this, you know, only the people who have problems go to therapy. Right. But back to the point, you know, I don't know that that's a necessity either if the kid's able to maintain, you know, all of their normal commitments and such. With a caveat, because sometimes kids are really good at covering up depression and thoughts. So I would keep pushing if it were me. Or if they are connected, maybe they're in sports and they're really connected to a coach, like have it come from somebody else. But to have it be a space at home where they feel comfortable talking about it, and starting that when they're little bitty, not necessarily talking about suicide when they're 3, right? But helping them understand that home is a safe place and that we can talk about anything here. And some of that sometimes is sharing your own stuff, like, hey, I'm really struggling with this. You know, not putting the burden on your kid, but helping them know that you're a human too, because humanness is messy. And then the other thing is just ask about it. And you don't have to know all the answers. There are a lot of good gatekeeper trainings, trainings for folks who are not mental health professionals, to help recognize the signs of suicide risk and to be able to know how to respond and refer appropriately. So there's one called QPR, Question, Persuade, Respond. I believe it's an online training. Cost associated with that one. Okay. Nominal, but there's one. And then there's ASK. I don't know what ASK stands for. ASK. Applied Suicide Knowledge, maybe. That's also available. And then there's just, I mean, you can just watch webinars. Like YouTube is great, right? For lots of education things. You can learn how to unclog a drain, and you can learn how to ask about suicide. But at the end of the day, you don't have to know all of the answers. Your kid just has to know that you're a safe place and that you can figure it out with them. So it's okay to say, you know, if kid, you ask kid, you know, how, I've noticed you're really sad lately. I'm just curious if you've ever thought about suicide. And the kid says, you know, maybe I don't know. Maybe I have. And then your gut response, your initial reaction is probably to freak out, right? It's a scary thing to notice that your kid is going through something like that. And maybe your follow-up is, great, let's talk about that more. Let's get you into therapy if that's what you want to do. How do we want to go through this? But maybe your response is, okay, thanks so much for sharing that with me. I love you. I'm here with you. I don't know what the next step is. Let's figure that out together. And even that response, the kid will connect with, and they'll know that you're there with them to help figure it out, that they're not alone, and they don't have to carry that by themselves.
If there were one thing that you could say you know, like, you don't really suspect suicide, you know, you don't really suspect any like deep depression or anxiety or whatever, but all of our kids are coming to us with some lots of questions, lots of fears, lots of under the surface anxieties, chronic anxieties, right? What would you say would be the most, and I didn't tell you I was going to ask you this, but so sorry, on the spot again.
You're fine.
What would you say would be the greatest gift that we could give our kids as far as the ability. I mean, obviously therapy is great, but just that ability to be with basically all of this feelings that we, be with their humanness. I mean, I guess is what I'm saying. Like,
yeah. I mean, I think it's just for your kids to see you being a human too.
Yeah.
And to know that you struggle, and to know that you don't have life figured out all the time, and that you go through stuff too, and that life sucked when you were 15 also, or 10, or whatever it is. I think it's important for kids to see that their parents aren't perfect. That all adults, right? No adult is perfect. And that you can be imperfect and still stable, and you've still got them.
Yeah.
And you still love them, and you still accept them. Just to be okay with the mess that is life.
Yeah, I love that you said that, because it's exactly what I was feeling. Like, it's exactly what I was feeling when I sit here, I can't help but just process through my own life, my own stories, my own family. Maybe you do that too while you're talking. I don't know. Mm-hmm. But that's what I was thinking. The better I get at being human, with my okayness, with my own humanity, like, it's going to ooze out my pores, and they're going to be okay with their own humanity. And
your kids' friends will know that you're okay with being a human, and will come.
Yeah.
It's a ripple effect.
Yeah. And I mean, really, that's like the answer to everything. Like, we don't have to go be super specific. What do we do about suicide? What do we do about addiction? What do we do about cutting? What do we do about, pornography? What do we do about all these different things, right? Mm-hmm. They're all just these symptoms of the same thing. Mm-hmm. We're just not okay with our humanity.
Yeah.
We're not okay with our dark feelings.
And that's what a lot of the, where suicidal thoughts brew too. It's not, when people are in their darkest moments and they're thinking about suicide, it is very rarely, I want to be dead, right? The thought is more, life is too painful. I don't know how to go on. I feel like I'm a burden to other people. It's like this deep, pervasive thoughts about the world being better off without them, and wanting their psychological pain to end, because they don't know any other way to do it. Mm-hmm. I think this especially shows up with our kids, right? Because adults, we have some life experience. We know that, like, today is today, and tomorrow, hopefully will be different, or next week is going to be different than today, right? But kids don't have that. Mm-hmm. Their brains are still developing, and they're very much in the moment. Mm-hmm. But it's not this, pervasive want to die. It's this profound desire to end their pain, and not knowing any other way to do that other than death.
Yeah. My husband has something he reminds me that, like, because everything can be really dramatic for me. Like, it's like, black or white, light or dark. And he always will remind me, like, this is a moment, this is a moment. And so, I forget. And I recently, my daughter had a moment, but she described it as, this day has been so horrible. She's only 6, but I was able to recall something Kyle had told me, and I was like, this is really just a moment. You just feel this way now. So, and it's really good to remember that we have moments of despair, but that they're just a moment. That's so comforting to me. Yeah. We did go off rails. Is there anything else that we didn't? Let me see. I brought this up to you, and I just thought I'd bring it up to you. It's one of my favorite guys. I listen to his podcast, Evoke Therapy Podcast. He's a therapist, Dr. Brad Reedy. I highly recommend that podcast, by the way. And he may have a podcast on suicide. I don't know, but he says he was. I wrote it down. He was referencing suicide, and talking to a youth, I think, and he said, part of you needs to die, not all of you. There is some part of you that you need to let go of in order to move on and be happy. You have made the mistake of thinking that all of you needs to die. This is simply not true. You see, there is no way out. This is a lie. It may be difficult and scary, but when you let go of an idea, a belief, of need to fit in or be good, you will find joy and liberation. And then he says, we must, and I think he's quoting Joseph Campbell, we must let go of the life we've planned so we can accept the one that is waiting for us. These feelings and thoughts are not the invitation to end the life, but rather it is a call to your new life. And I thought, that's really interesting that there is a part of us, probably there's a part of all of us that probably needs to die. What do you think about that thought?
Yeah, I mean, I can think of lots of things that need to die. The, this expectation to be liked universally, this expectation to, never upset anybody or to do everything right all the time, like this perfectionism, I think, that we go through life with. But yeah, I mean, it speaks to, particular intervention in therapy or model called IFS, Internal Family Systems. And the idea behind it is that each human, right, we're each made up of our own parts. And there are negative parts, there are neutral parts, there are positive parts, and all of them serve some kind of purpose for us. And so with relation to suicidal thoughts, when those come up, there is a part of you that is thinking about suicide as a response to something. And so until that is figured out, like, why am I thinking about suicide, and whatever the deeper thing is uncovered and resolved and whatnot, that suicidal part is flaring up and saying, like, pay attention, something's wrong, something needs to be fixed. And so, yeah, I think that quote speaks to that aspect, that it is just one part of many that make each of us up.
Yeah. Again, learning to be human.
Yeah.
We have those parts.
The lesson of today.
Those parts. Yeah. I think it's a lesson that needs to get, if I would tattoo it on my head, but then I'd never see it unless I looked in the mirror.
True.
I'm going to figure out a way to put, you are human, and it's okay.
And it's okay. Yeah.
Yeah, it's okay. So let's just wrap this up with where to get help, immediate help, right? Obviously, you are not like the person to call if you are. I mean, tell us when you are the person to call.
Yep, that's a good question. So the crisis lines are available for folks who are in immediate crisis. That can be you responding to, a loved one or a kiddo or family member. It could be the kiddo reaching out. If you're in immediate crisis and you don't know where to go, the crisis lines are the best route. There is a crisis text line, 741-741. It's available 24/7 for anybody. It's a text line, right? So people who don't like to call. And they're trained counselors. It's a rigorous program. I was a volunteer there for several years. And it's phenomenal. So, so sometimes there's a little bit of a wait, especially if it's late at night, but you get reminder text. You're still in queue. We're still here for you. And then you speak to somebody that's trained on how to handle a crisis, and they will, if you need higher level of care, if they need some kind of referrals, they'll do that for you. But a lot of that work is just de-escalating and talking down. And, again, this is a moment, right? Yeah. And then there's a new National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, which is moving to 988 in July. So right now it's a 1-800-273-8255. So it's a bigger number to remember. Okay. But Congress passed a legislation in 2020, July of 2020, to approve 988 as a hotline for mental health crises in America, similar to 911 for public for chronic physical emergencies. 988 will be the hotline for mental health emergencies starting in July of this year. But for right now, it's 1-800-273-8255. Okay. We are available, and there are other, so I'm the only one, right, that my practice is the only one that works exclusively with suicide. And suicide is not, like we talked about earlier, right, not covered often in graduate programs, but there are other therapists. There are several in the area that I refer to sometimes as well, that do have experience and training in working with suicide. So they're out there. I'm happy to refer to if you want to hook up with me and go to my website and contact form and whatnot, or email. But outpatient therapy is ideally for, I'm not at crisis yet. I'm recognizing that this is an issue. I want to process it and get through it so that I don't have to go to the hospital, or especially on the other side of it. I was just in the hospital. My kid was just in the hospital. I need to connect them to outpatient therapy afterward. And then inpatient is considered the highest level of care. And that's if, really kid has a plan or person has a plan, has intent, has a method, and is intent on carrying this out, then inpatient hospitalization is the right call at that point. And just making sure that you're really supportive on the other side of them getting out. Yeah,
it's like, I'm sure like everything, a family disease, I don't want to call it a disease, but it's a family dynamic that has to be addressed because we're a team.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention something about lethal means too.
Oh yeah, please.
So we don't, people can't die by suicide if they don't have means to do that with, right?
Okay.
And here in Texas, of course, it's a very gun heavy state. And no judgment. I'm not going to speak to that here, but to be conscious of, if we do have guns in our home, they need to be locked up. The ammunition separate from the gun. And especially kids, because they're more impulsive, right? Brain's still getting figured out, still developing. Kids should not know how to access that gun. And most kids know how to access guns. If they're in the house, even if they're locked up, even if they have a combination, most children know how to access the guns.
Really? Even if, they would know the combination, or, what if it's like a fingerprint?
Yeah. So fingerprints are,
the best?
pretty foolproof. Yeah.
Okay.
Or just going back and changing your combination.
Unless they cut your thumb off.
Unless they cut your thumb off. And then you got a bigger issue.
Then you got a bigger issue. I had to laugh. I just had to laugh. It's a heavy topic.
Yep. Fair. But yeah, going back and changing the combination now, or getting a safe if you don't have one.
Yeah.
Or if you realize that a loved one is in a suicidal crisis, to give the gun somewhere else. Like maybe you have an uncle or a neighbor or something that can store it for a short period of time. Yeah. Medications too. Those are two popular means, especially for adolescents, are guns and medication. So locking up, and I know for foster care, you have to do that, but even in other households, making sure that kids don't even have the opportunity, right? So that they can get through those moments without that chance
Give that the semicolon.
Yeah.
That's the semicolon.
There you go.
Right, the pause.
Yep.
So that we can regulate, move up to our frontal, our executive brain, and we can think, we can reason, we can connect, we can be received from other people. Yeah, this is good. Okay, wow. We did all right, didn't we? I didn't have only a tiny tear.
Has it already been an hour?
I don't know. I don't know if it's been an hour, but I feel like, unless there's something else, I feel like we covered a lot. There was one thing that I wanted to bring up, because I mentioned that I felt like medication was an issue in my dad's death. And I don't know the numbers of kids in care who are on psychotropic drugs, but it's very, 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 very big. And I think it continues to get bigger and bigger every day. Obviously, we need to lock up the medication, but there are side effects to those drugs that we need to be aware of, right?
Yeah, I think there are side effects to anything, but yeah, and I'm not a psychiatrist, so I can't speak too much of the topic. But yeah, if kiddos are on, or anybody is on any kind of medication, to be conscious of side effects, the ones that are on the labels themselves, and also just noticing when they're not acting themselves, and then responding, right? If they need to get back into the doctor because they're acting funny or saying weird things, or have a weird somatic sensation, whatever it is, making sure that there's a lot of communication and follow up with the doctor, especially in those first 30, 60 days that they start medication, because it is, it takes an adjustment. There's an adjustment period for the body to get used to it. And on the other end too, if they're at a point where they're ready to get off of those, to make sure that they're not just quitting cold turkey, that they're working with a doctor to step down and monitoring side effects at that point as well. Yeah,
absolutely. And sometimes I know this from just hearing people, you don't get long sometimes to communicate in like a 15-minute appointment with the doctor, or a friend of mine was just telling me that her doctor was on a Zoom, and it was literally a 15-minute thing, and it was basically just to get the medication. And so I just think we are the advocates.
Exactly.
We have to be saying, no, I need to talk to you. I need, this is what's going on, and just really push, because like I said, it was a big factor for my dad, weaning off of a drug. And so that's important that we make sure we know what we're doing in that area. And we don't know what we're doing, but somebody needs to know what we're doing and have their hands on my kid, right?
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing, though, advocacy, right? Being the advocate for your person, whoever it is, or yourself if you're the person that's going through it. And that teaches our young people to be advocates for themselves too. If they see their caregiver, their parent, their loved one
standing up for them,
standing up,
saying, no, this isn't long enough. We have more to talk about.
Exactly.
So,
yep.
Thank you. You know what? I hope I never have to see you professionally.
Thank you. Likewise.
I'm going to keep practicing being human, but I sure did. I enjoyed this conversation, and it is, I think my biggest takeaway is just to create space to be human, create space to feel, Because we all want to belong, but if we think we have to be more than we are to belong, yeah, it's not really very belonging.
No.
Yeah.
Create space to not be okay.
To not be okay. My poor family, they have seen me not be okay so much. They still love me, right, honey? Oh, yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for joining us. And all of those, would you mind sending a link, and we'll put all of that information, those numbers and everything in the show notes and the graphics, and we'll have that figured out somehow. So,
definitely.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us today. This is a heavy topic. I think it's important not to go into a place of fear, because we're just building a toolbox of awareness and affirmation to know that things are okay to talk about. I mean, if there was one thing I would want you to hear today, is that everything's on the table to talk about. Everything's okay. The way we feel, it's okay to share with your kids, I don't know what I'm doing, and I'm scared, or I feel alone, but I know I'm going to be okay, and I think just reminding ourselves, and having people around you that remind you of that. Like I said, my husband does that for me, reminds me, like, this is just a moment, and we're going to move through it. It's okay. And that is very comforting. And so if we can do that for ourselves, if we can put people in our life that help us through that, it points our kids into that same direction of they can do that too. So anyway, I hope you feel our spirit and our connection to you, and that you could just give yourself a big hug and enjoy the rest of your week. We'll see you next time. Mama's well. Yes, she is.